Hey YouTube, it's Jungle Walker again, and I'm getting started on my next project, which is going to be a background for my scorpion terrarium that you saw in my last video. And I've been holding on to this huge sheet of plastic for probably about a year now. I knew it would come in handy one day, and finally I'm going to start using it. So I've already measured out the background of the tank, which is about 15 inches across by 19 inches tall. And I've cut a background sheet for this. So the way I'm going to be making this terrarium is using great stuff, which is a really popular solution for this kind of thing. However, I don't want to use the great stuff directly on the back of the tank for several reasons. Number one, I'm honestly not all that confident in my own work. So in the event that I decide it looks horrible or I mess up terribly, I don't want this tank to be completely destroyed. If I just put it on a sheet of plastic, then if I decide I don't like it, I can just take it, move it off. Second reason is some people have actually broken their tanks using great stuff. The foam expands and hardens very aggressively, and if you use too much and you do it like in a corner, it can actually expand and pop the glass apart and break it, kind of like if you fill up a water bottle with ice and put it in the freezer. The ice will expand and then rupture the container it's in. So for those reasons, I'm going to build the background on this piece of plastic, and then once it's finished, I'm going to put it into the back of the tank. Now, my design considerations are pretty loose right now. I do know that I want to have some kind of pool or reservoir in the bottom, and I want it to kind of seep over into the rest of the soil, because I use my tank as like a starter for little cuttings and seedlings, stuff like that. So I want the soil to stay hydrated if I were to go away for like a week or two or maybe even a month. My second design consideration is I want to have like multiple shelves that are kind of formed on the background that kind of come out and have a little pot area for me to put plants, and then I'll have a plastic hose that runs up from the bottom to the top, cascades into Waterfall, and then will just flow down through the different levels and hydrate all the plants before ultimately flowing back into the reservoir. So I've got a limited amount of soil that I can move to the side, meaning that I can't have the water level too high or it might seep out of the tank. So a lot of the design is still pretty fluid, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do right now, but I'm just kind of feeling my way through it, and we'll see what happens. So here we go in the build. I'm taking the tubing and measuring it against the background. I want to get the appropriate height so that the tube extends all the way to the bottom and then most of the way up to the top. Once I cut it down to size, I need to straighten it out. So I've taped it to the door of that cabinet, and I use a heat gun to get it to more of a straight shape. Here I have the two halves of the background. This ended up being unnecessary because I could just take the doors off the terrarium and slide the whole thing in and out. So I've taken a flat piece of styrofoam and I've glued it to the back. On this flat piece of styrofoam, I'm basically going to build the entire thing off of it. So first I've got to cut a channel in the background for the pipe to go all the way up. I've measured the appropriate distance, and I'm using my knife to cut a little wedge out of the middle. It doesn't go all the way to the top because the waterfall is going to empty into a little basin towards the top. It's going to be probably 4/5 of the way up there. I'm kind of eyeballing most of this, by the way. So once I've fitted the tube down into the channel, I use the great stuff to hold it in place. The great stuff that I'm using is just the industrial type that you'd use to seal around your house. But in hindsight, I recommend using the type that's specifically meant for working with ponds and water fixtures, because that's going to be more friendly to your little critters. With this stuff, you definitely want to seal it so none of the chemicals can leach into the water. People still use it though, but they seal it in silicone, and it's kind of a hassle, and I'd rather not worry about little leaks getting into the great stuff. So what I've basically done is I took a big piece of styrofoam and I broke it and cut it down into sections, just little pieces or shapes that look interesting. I'm basically turning this into a bunch of building blocks, and I'm fitting a structure based out of those pieces. So my idea was I would have a basic tree shape that went up the up the center by where the tube is. I've got my first little ledge, the top ledge that the waterfall starts at, and I've used great stuff to cement it into place. Once I have the bottom ledge, I'm going to fit pieces around the side and kind of form the lip of the waterfall. The advantage of using these styrofoam blocks is that while the great stuff tends to be really pliable and not conform to a specific shape, you can use it more as a mortar for the styrofoam pieces. The great stuff is really good because it expands and fills out crevices, but it has a tendency to form little channels that water can seep down into. So when you're constructing things with the great stuff, you definitely want to make sure that you get it filled into all the little spaces, because if you have channels, the water can seep down into there, and it doesn't necessarily hurt things, but it's not desirable. You can easily see how the pieces of styrofoam help give structure to the great stuff. It really helps to hold things into place. Don't worry about shapes being too blocky and edgy right now, because we'll handle that later. You just want to get the rough, crude shape out. What I'm doing here is building up a nice little lip. I want to fill this top shelf with sand or media of some kind, and then ideally put some kind of plants up there. You can definitely see everything start to take more shape here. I didn't really know what I was doing going into this, but I kind of developed the design where I would have one channel flow down into the next channel, a series of waterfalls. I would recommend that you have more gradual waterfalls. What ended up happening was, since the water would splash down from several inches in height into one basin from another, I had a lot of splashing, and that was really undesirable. It would have been better to have more of a cascading effect, like just a gentle meandering, than a lot of splashing, because that builds up on your glass and leaves water spots. Here's what I meant about not worrying about blockiness and edges. I'm using my knife and my file to trim off all the harsh edges and give it a very natural, rounded look. You want to take off as many of the sharp edges and corners as possible. They give it a very unnatural look. You want everything to be rounded. The great stuff has a tendency to form this kind of weird, knotted shape, which gives it a very interesting woodland effect, but it tends to look unnatural. So you might want to give that a sand down, or apply the great stuff in a way that it doesn't tend to build up the texture that you see there. So what I'm doing here is building out a ledge. For the scorpions, this ended up being their favorite space. They spend most of their time underneath that ledge, which is a good and bad thing because then I can't really see them that well. But they feel very secure. Again, if you're building this for a critter like I was, you definitely want to build it with their needs in mind. And it helps to be able to give them more of a natural environment. So from here you can definitely see the basic shape. The nice thing about great stuff is it's very easy to shape. You can sand it, cut it, trim it. I didn't want it to look like a brick house, so I used my knife to trim out all the excess that tended to exude from the cracks between the pieces of styrofoam that I chipped together. Again, taking off anything that doesn't look natural. I want it to look as much as possible like a natural scenic waterfall. Be careful when you're doing stuff like this that you don't break your styrofoam off. When you're designing your waterfall, you'll learn that it's difficult to get the water to behave exactly as you want. What I did at several points throughout the project was hook it up to a water pump that I had laying around and give it a test run to see the flow of the water. Now here I could definitely see where water was seeping. But overall, it worked. I took a Sharpie and I marked the spots that I needed to fill in, and then I went back and adjusted it to make it more watertight. Well, this is it for part 1. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2 coming up soon, where we finish out the project.